All right, we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us on the website, Twitch, Twitter, wherever you are coming to us from. Thank you so much for making us a part of your day here at 110 Sports. Josh Doring, Chris Brown, they are here with me. Fellas, how you doing on a lovely Friday morning?
Urban Meyer's the coach of the Jaguars. James Harden's in net. It's been a lot this week.
It's laugh out loud funny, the reports about Urban Meyer's. Part of Urban Meyer's negotiating was about the facilities, because that just screams college coach, right? It's like you're gonna sign guys and you're gonna draft guys, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's very Urban Meyer of him to be really to be pointing at the facilities as a part of negotiation.
Yeah, it's very, very on brand. Very on brand. This whole situation with him is it's an on brand thing, but it's certainly going to make the Jaguars a much more interesting team to watch moving forward, which is not something that I thought I would necessarily be saying. So there's that.
Right, and Chris and I talked about this when the report started surfacing. This idea that people in the NFL aren't in love with his track record in terms of the way he's handled things, and you can go back and forth about morality and all of that stuff. But ultimately, if you're the Jaguars, you went from being the Jaguars to having Urban Meyer and Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah.
The Jets don't need Urban Meyer to be relevant. They play in New York.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Jaguars. So there is that aspect to it, that if some team needed to do this just to, whether it works or not, to be interesting and be part of the conversation, similar to the Bucs with Tom Brady. Nobody was really paying attention to Jameis Winston's Buccaneers when they were 7-9 every season.
Mm-hmm.
But all of a sudden you got real interesting because Tom Brady's there. It's kind of sort of along that same line, and probably even to a greater degree, because the Bucs have had some success in the not so distant past.
Mm-hmm.
But that, to me, that's kind of what it comes down to, is how do you feel about Urban Meyer? If there's a team to take that risk and to give this a shot, it's gonna be a win-win situation. It's Jacksonville, because they become relevant, even if it doesn't end up working. Then you move on, you go find somebody else for the next part of Trevor Lawrence's career.
See, but I almost feel like Trevor Lawrence being there makes the risk not as worth it, because Trevor Lawrence makes you relevant. So why not go get a guy that is, or at least try to get a guy that has proven himself in the NFL, instead of the guy that is just going to get you in headlines more because of his name. I mean, I certainly get the point, but I don't know, if I'm in my head, if I'm in the front office, I'm being more risky with the first 3 years, 4 years, whatever it is, of Trevor Lawrence's career than is necessary. Because, I mean, undoubtedly it would make more sense, at least from a safety perspective, to try and get somebody who's proven himself in the NFL. With that being said, yeah. I certainly get it, and that's not to say that I have written off Urban Meyer's capability of coaching in the NFL. I just don't know yet. But it's, the Bucs got Tom Brady, so they didn't have to do anything ridiculous with their coaching staff. Mm-hmm. I feel like Trevor Lawrence can put you in the same situation, but when you put the two of them together, they instantly become the most interesting team in the NFL, because they have Urban Meyer, because they have Trevor Lawrence, and now the nucleus of their football team is completely different.
My counter to that would be, in most situations, I agree with you, but that roster is just so depleted that it'll be interesting for a year just to see what Trevor Lawrence does. But if they're just bad, I'm not sure that him by himself brings them into the national conversation the way that Tom Brady did, because you gave him Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and Gronk.
Sure. I also think you're unfairly comparing Tom Brady and Trevor Lawrence right now.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That's right. So that's part of it, is that Trevor Lawrence hasn't played in the NFL, so yeah, he's going to be interesting because he's number 1 overall pick, transcendent talent, but he doesn't, exactly to your point, he isn't as interesting by himself as Tom Brady is, because he doesn't have Tom Brady's pedigree.
Sure.
So yeah, it's absolutely a fair question of, do you want to take this kind of risk? Right. But at the same time, I think to elevate them into the point where they want teams, networks want to have them. They're not just the team that plays every week that you want them on Sunday Night Football or Monday Night Football or whatever. I almost feel like the situation is so bad from a national prominence standpoint that you kind of need both.
Sure.
Yeah. TV executives are sure going to love it.
Oh, yeah.
And speaking of the Buccaneers still playing football. They take on the Saints in the divisional round this weekend. We'll get to the divisional round in the middle of the show today. If we have time, do some best, most interesting games of the weekend that are outside of the world of the NFL playoffs. But to start, we'll start with the biggest elephant in the room and the granddaddy of all things that happened this week in the sports world. James Harden's a net, and that's the most basic part of the trade because there's a million other things that also happened. The Rockets in this trade ended up getting Victor Oladipo, Rodions Kurucs, Dante Exum, and then 8 unprotected first-round picks. They get Brooklyn's 2022, 2024, and 2026 pick, as well as a Milwaukee 2022 pick. And then they get unprotected first-round pick swaps in 2021, 23, 25, and 27. It's constructed like that because you can't trade first-round picks in back-to-back years, so you have to do pick swaps to alternate to fall within the guidelines of the NBA and what's allowed to be traded. So that's what the Rockets got for James Harden. And then there were these teams that, became peripheral pieces, but teams that did really interesting and team-improving things. At least there's an argument for it. The Pacers in a trade with the Rockets. I guess a trade. I guess it was technically with the Rockets, right? They get.
That's how I would yeah.
After Karis LeVert gets traded and the Rockets Nets trade Karis LeVert and traded to the Pacers for Victor Oladipo. The Pacers also got a 2023 second-round pick. Kevin Pritchard continues to be elite in the front office in Indiana, getting a guy who's still got 2+ years left on his contract and a second-round pick for a guy in Oladipo who is probably not going to be a Pacer past this season. And the Cavaliers get Jarrett Allen, one of the best young bigs in the NBA today, or at least the most reliable, and then Taurean Prince as well, another, I believe he's in his 4th year out of Baylor. So a ton has happened here. James Harden is a net. Of course, that's the headline. But a lot of things also going on around the edges in this 4-team trade. Absolutely massive. Josh, we'll start with you. The thing that jumped out to you first, the trade, how you feel about James Harden being a net, wherever you want to go. What was your reaction to this trade?
Yeah, we talked about this on our podcast yesterday, and to me it comes down to one thing at the end, which is that the price that they paid is not justified by the amount this move increases their chances of winning a title. And we can get into the specific reasons why I feel that way. But I don't think James Harden makes them that much better to where they're all of a sudden a surefire title contender in the sense that you'd be surprised if they don't get out of the Eastern Conference and are ready to go toe-to-toe with the Lakers. Because at the end of the day, for what you gave up, the only way that you win this trade, regardless of how these picks turn out and whether Houston's theory that by the time those later picks are turned into real people, that the Nets are going to be in a rebuild and they're going to be much more valuable, whether that's true or not, the only way you can win this trade is if you win a title. And we'll get into all of the specifics, but it makes them better, sure, because this is a ridiculously good offensive team now. But it doesn't make them that much better that I can sit here and say it was worth what they gave up.
It's pretty impressive that the Rockets got what they got from the Nets when everybody and their mother knew that James Harden, we've talked about this on both sides of the equation, right? The Rockets didn't have to give up James Harden because he has, multiple years left on his contract. So it's not like they needed to take something less than what he was worth just to make sure they got something out of it. But at the same time, the Rockets lose a little bit of leverage when everybody and their mother knows that James Harden wants out, and everybody and their mother knows that the Rockets are basically telling James Harden to not come to work because it's just too. I mean, you're more of a headache than you're worth at this point, so just don't show up to work. We'll play basketball without you, and they still end up with this, with basically the Nets' entire future. And right, we can talk about those picks 100% look more attractive now than they'll probably actually look when they turn into players. Like that's the biggest secret in NBA negotiations is that your first round pick or your number one overall pick looks a whole lot better when it's a hypothetical number one overall pick than it is when it's an actual player. I mean, everybody wanted that Timberwolves number one pick. Nobody wants Anthony Edwards, right? Like nobody's knocking on the Timberwolves doorstep saying we want Anthony Edwards. Let's do a trade. But everybody was trying to get that number one overall pick. Chris, what about you? Like the trade? Don't like the trade? Issues with it? And then I'll jump in.
Yeah. So, when I had to sort of stop myself because when the information was first coming out, I was just completely overwhelmed by what we were witnessing happening. I was seeing it, and then I see something else, and I got confused, and so I had to like put down the phone for a while, come back to it, and then try to digest everything that was happening. Um, from the Nets' perspective, um, in some sense, I'm by nature not going to be too inclined to be too heavily critical of a team that is willing to fork out the cash, fork out the resources to try to win now and go all in now. In some sense, I don't want to be just by nature and particularly coming from a baseball mindset. I'm not going to be too critical of any front office who's really trying to commit um, to win, to win with what they have now and to try to go all in. At the same time, I'm with I think both of you in the sense that I am questioning if this is a trade that is so valuable that it's worth trading all that future draft stock. And it is, like you said, Josh, something that has to pay off with them winning a title, and that has to come most likely within the next season or two because that's all they have of Harden guaranteed. And there are just so many. Obviously, it's an exciting time for Brooklyn, right? When you have three of the top 20, 25 players in the league on the same roster, the ceiling of that team is pretty high, undoubtedly. But I just have so many questions. There's just so much risk involved. There's so many aspects from them paying that extravagant price when the Rockets obviously were everybody, like you said, everybody knew that they were looking to trade him. They were in that situation to questions about how and if Harden's going to embrace that new culture and the style he's going to have to play there to the historical evidence of that going all in with offense and an average defense hasn't exactly been a great formula for winning titles to the Nets not giving themselves much time for this gamble to pay off to they're essentially out of bullets if to add other pieces that might impact their postseason ceiling now. They don't have many other options there. So there's so many aspects of this with risk that it's certainly not a trade that I think I would have made if I were the Nets, but I'm not going to be super critical of it. It's just a big risk and there's one way that it'll pay off. If it doesn't work, then that's a gamble that didn't pay off. Um, but it's certainly a very risky one. I agree that I'll just say this real quickly. I agree the Rockets, you know, for a team that had no choice to work out a trade, like you said, they got one heck of a return. Their draft asset pool was really dried up thanks a lot to the Russell Westbrook trade, and now all of a sudden, in a blink of an eye, it's suddenly overflowing. And now they have a good deal of flexibility whether or not they re-sign Oladipo. Um, Maybe he never gets back to that elite level, but maybe he does, and they're able to lock him up. Either way, they have a lot of flexibility now. Um, I like what the Pacers got as well, and the Cavaliers. So yeah, I guess those are my overall takeaways. There's just so many questions with the Nets, so many things that only time is really going to tell how it works out. It's just a big gamble, not a gamble I would have taken, but Now we just kind of have to wait.
So a couple things. One, it's I think the fact that Kyrie Irving's inevitable, not sure what you're going to get from him, is he going to show up to work today, plays a factor in this trade.
100%.
Because and as well as some of the other happenings in the Nets organization in the last couple of weeks from a health standpoint, because I'm genuinely not sure that I'm not sure they make this trade if Kyrie Irving hasn't had this leave of absence and Spencer Dinwiddie is healthy, because through the first week of the season we were all singing praises to the Nets. I mean, there was a lot of overreacting going on when it came to the Brooklyn Nets and how good they were looking and how good their chemistry looked immediately. And then Spencer Dinwiddie gets hurt, and that's an important part of your offense. That's a key peripheral piece. And when Kyrie wasn't on the floor last year and in the last few years, Spencer Dinwiddie has proven himself a very important part of Nets' success. So he's out. And then you have Kyrie Irving, and then you're very quickly reminded that Kyrie Irving is very much a wild card, and you never really know what's going on in his head or what he's going to do. And so all of a sudden, a team that 2 games into the season, a week into the season, looked like a team that we were all talking about, yeah, this team's chemistry, and the way that they've come out of the gates, if this is really what they are, then they have a chance to truly contend. And then you get to a week ago, and Spencer Dinwiddie's out, and you don't know when Kyrie Irving's coming back, and then all of a sudden things don't exactly look like it's enough. And I certainly wasn't sold on the Nets having enough to win a title in the first place. And so and with those two things happening, even more so. So from that perspective, I certainly understand the desire to go and get another star. And the Nets happen to be the place that James Harden talked about wanting to go, and talked about basically forcing his way to Brooklyn. And Brooklyn ended up being able to give them the best package overall, and one that they couldn't say no to, I feel like. But so it just worked out that way. But I understand the Nets trying to find a way to make sure that, quite frankly, that going out and getting Kevin Durant and signing him is worth it, because with the current state previously to James Harden, being traded, I'm not sure. Like, that version of the Nets wasn't going to win a title. It wasn't. And I'm certainly not sold that this version of the Nets is going to win a title. But I think what's happened in the last few days, the last few weeks, and the fact that the Nets are 7-6 right now, or I guess they might be 8-6 now, but that they're a lot closer to 500 than I thought they would be through 14, 15 games, also has a big part to play in it.
That, to me, is the reason why the Rockets were able to win this negotiation. And by win this negotiation, I mean get what they wanted for James Harden, even though, as you guys have pointed out, in a sense, they didn't have a lot of leverage, because it wasn't like he was going to be happy playing for them. Mm. But at the same time, they had all the leverage in the world, because they could just go, okay, if you want to get out, then you need to go convince somebody to pay a price. We're not just going to let you leave because you're unhappy. We'll deal with it. If you want to throw a temper tantrum, fine. Mm-hmm. But the Nets, I think, entered another level of desperation with everything that's happened, and this idea that I don't know what's going on with Kyrie. I'm not here to cast judgment on him, make any assumptions, whatever. Mm. But the idea that Kyrie just sort of disappears from your organization is not surprising.
No.
So at some point, you've got to provide coverage for that, which is part of what this is doing. And then you get to, I want to revisit one of the points Chris made about all of the questions, because there are so many questions on so many different levels here. You had the basketball ones, as in, can this team that's not going to play and to me, they were an average defensive team before this. They are just a flat-out bad defensive team now. We'll see what it looks like, but I just have a hard time believing this team's going to be anywhere near average defensively.
Right, and they were average.
They just lost their worst defender.
Right. That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah.
The players they traded were their best defenders,
and the guys that made this work. Interested in playing defense more importantly.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Jared Allen gave you rim protection. that they gave away their defense. So there's that question. And then there's the other part of this, which is and I'm not even going to say can, you cannot find a way, it is not possible to maximize all three of these players on the same team, specifically Kyrie and James Harden, because they're both at their best with the ball in their hands. Their gift is their ability to break down defenses. They cannot simultaneously do that. There's one basketball.
Yep.
And then the other part of it is, okay, so who's got the ball in their hands at the end of games? Because I think if you ask the three of those guys who should have it, you're gonna get three different answers. Unless KD thinks it's Kyrie too. So there's that part of it. And then you get to the off the court stuff, which I think also kind of is getting lost in this, that I've been worried about since the minute these rumors started happening, and even when Kyrie and KD signed, that it's an odd marriage between those two, because Durant's not the vocal guy, Kyrie is the vocal guy, but not necessarily the guy you want being the vocal guy,
and not in a sense of leadership.
Right. But Durant's not the guy that's going to keep him in check. He's the opposite of LeBron in many ways, personality wise. And then you throw James Harden into this mix. So you've got the question of when, and again, I'm not trying to draw a correlation between the fact that they started struggling and Kyrie stopped coming to work. I don't know what was happening. I honestly don't think it was specifically related to what was happening on the court in Brooklyn. But all of a sudden, the first time things didn't go well, you lost Kyrie. What happens when things don't go well in the playoffs? And again, I don't think it's connected, but it's still worth pointing out. That's why Josh, you're right there with me, I think, had questions about this team getting out of the East anyway. And now I have those questions even more because you threw James Harden into the mix. There's a reason the Clippers were the team that fell apart in the bubble. That's not an accident. That's not a coincidence. There's a reason the Lakers were the team that and the Heat were the teams that thrived in the bubble. And that LeBron, in the blink of an eye, turned his team from, I don't know if the Lakers have enough, they're not looking good, to, oh, these guys are clearly the best team in the NBA. Right. That's not an accident. The guys that the Nets have are not the guys you look at as being able to do that. Because it's not LeBron's talent. It's LeBron's leadership and just the way that LeBron runs his team and what he expects from people.
And he also just happens to be the best player on the planet.
Right. There's that too.
Helps a little bit.
but your point is certainly there.
There are so many questions on so many different levels here that you're just inviting by taking away the formula that has worked for basically every championship team since the Big Three, which is one or two stars and all these really good role players. And that's a little disrespectful to your Kyle Lowrys and Fred VanVleets and Pascal Siakams of the world, because they're not role players, they're all stars. But the point is still the same, that it's LeBron and AD, and then it's Kyle Kuzma and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and the list goes on. And it's all of those Raptors guys helping Kawhi, and the Warriors have a defensive player of the year in Draymond Green. Now, it's a different conversation because it's the Warriors, but the last big three we had was Miami. And it's not fair to compare those two because we've never seen a team go all in on offense like this, with pieces that don't fit basketball wise.
Yeah. And that's my biggest head scratching. The biggest head scratching part of this, because I mean, of course it makes to a certain extent sense because it's James Harden, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving on the same team, and having that much scoring to a certain extent makes sense. But the sense stops there. It really does. It doesn't create an incredible mismatch. It's a point guard, a shooting guard, and a forward. So it's not like they're hard to guard. And Josh, you and I talked about this yesterday, but like Milwaukee is literally built on accident to guard the Nets.
I'll take that matchup all day long if I'm the Bucks.
I mean, it's Giannis on Kevin Durant, Drew Holiday on Kyrie Irving, and Chris Middleton on James Harden. There's not a team in the NBA more well-equipped to handle them, and they're probably going to have to go through them at some point to get to the NBA Finals. And then on the peripherals, every other player on the Bucks is better than the other players that are on the Nets because they gave up all of their good players to get James Harden. Um, you know, Joe Harris, nice, but like DeAndre Jordan being an incredibly important part of your basketball team in 2021 is not something that I would want if I'm a Nets fan. Um, there's never been, and it's not like I have a place to point to when I say something like a big three like this doesn't work. You know why? Because nobody has tried to put a big three like this together before. Because the whole point of a big three is having three guys that are the best at whatever they do. James Harden
and they complement each other.
That complement each other. James Harden and Kevin Durant might be, the two best pure scorers in the NBA right now, but they do the same thing. They're pure scorers. And Kyrie Irving and James Harden might have the best handles in the NBA right now and might be the best at breaking down defenses in the NBA right now and finishing at the rim, but they both do that. And it's not like either of them is great without the ball in their hands and moving and all of those things. So, and that's what made the Warriors so great is because everybody was so unselfish and everyone moved without the basketball. But the Warriors are an anomaly, and I try not to completely compare them here. But if you look at the other big threes, in Miami, it was LeBron. It was Dwayne Wade, who had been the heart and soul in Miami. They had similar skill sets at the time, but certainly different ones. And then you had Chris Bosh on the interior. In Boston, you had Ray Allen, who was one of the two best three-point shooters of all time and was the best three-point shooter on the planet at the time. Paul Pierce, who was just it. He had it. He wanted the ball in his hands in the big moments. And Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett were always submissive to that, and there was no issues with that. It just made sense for Paul Pierce to have the ball in his hands late in games and be that guy. And then Kevin Garnett was the heart and soul of your team and the defensive foundation and power and whatever other adjective you want to throw Kevin Garnett's way. Nobody's ever put a big three together like this. And certainly not at the expense of the rest of your roster. I mean, they took away all the other good parts of their roster, essentially, except Joe Harris, who is just going to fit on any NBA team right now because he will stand in the corner and knock down threes. But you took away a lot of your rebounding. You certainly took away a lot of your depth. You took Taurean Prince and Karis LeVert off the bench. You go from having one of the most intriguing benches in the NBA to having essentially no bench, right? You're having Luwawa Cabarrot come off the bench now. And DeAndre Jordan starting on a team that fancies winning the East? No. That's not what I want at all, especially when I have a guy like Jared Allen on my roster previously. It is, I won't go all the way to this trade doesn't make sense, but I'm pretty close to it because it just doesn't, nobody has done this before. Nobody's tried to put a big three together like this. And it's not like there weren't chances to. They haven't done it because it doesn't make sense. And and like Josh has said, and I think this is the perfect way to put it, there is zero way to maximize all three of them on the floor at the same time. And if there's zero chance of maximizing them on the floor at the same time, then why did you do it? Right? Why did you? Then it is by definition not worth it. That's why I think that's part of why big twos work so well, and that it's not hard to figure out how to put LeBron James and Anthony Davis on the floor together. It's just not. And then you put solid pieces around them like, Dennis Schroeder or Montrezl Harrell, Marc Gasol. It's very, very easy to make that work. And very, very easy for Anthony Davis to man the middle and, do some pick and rolls with LeBron or do pick and rolls with whoever the guard is. And it's just so easy. And having two big guys and just a solid basketball team around them is just so easy, much easier to put together. And in a lot of ways makes so much sense. And if nothing else, it worries me that in an NBA that is clearly in the big two phase right now, and since Miami won championships, a big three in that sense hasn't won a title, that the Nets are going the opposite direction and trying to win a title with a big three and literally nothing else.
Yeah, and it just, the thing that I keep coming back to, that it's sort of a philosophy that I have with almost every sport is, I mean, obviously you need to have some degree of star power. Depth alone isn't, you can't just rely on, throwing out a roster of 9 good players with no stars. Like, that's not going to work. But at the same time, you have to have, like, successful teams have multiple ways to win games in basically every sport. There are exceptions, but when you're making yourself, I don't like necessarily when teams make themselves so one dimensional, when their pathway to winning
Sure.
is this one formula. And even if you think that you have some of the best players to win with that formula, that still makes it such that, an injury, a certain circumstance, a bad matchup against an opponent that's able to defend that, all of a sudden you can't just pivot to a different approach because you're not going to win by locking down on defense with that roster. Like, there's just no way to pivot. And I guess, right when they're going all in that approach, you don't want to pivot. At the same time, I just don't like the idea of necessarily locking yourself in on one pathway, and it's either going to be this way or it's not going to work. If it works, obviously that's if they win that title, okay, that's great. But I don't like when you take a team that has multiple ways to win, that has this depth, that has these ways to pivot, and all of a sudden now they got one way. I don't like cutting off your options like that.
And real quick before we take a break here, I also want to give a shout out to the Cavaliers and the Pacers for what they did. You get Jared Allen, that's your third foundational piece if you're Cleveland. Allows you to do what you want with Andre Drummond, not have to worry about his future, and to get you a guy who's better fit to be on a successful team. With the way that those guards are playing, they are on track to be a playoff team in the East for years to come if they can keep building these pieces. So I like that part of it. They didn't give up too much, and they got a really good young center in Jared Allen. And the Pacers. Everybody, I see all these grades giving the Pacers a B+. They took Victor Oladipo, who, if there's one player in the NBA who should actually feel respected or feel appreciative to their organization for what they've done, it's Oladipo, because the Pacers resurrected his career.
Yep.
And all of a sudden he's out here, and I don't know what's true or what's not, but there have been enough rumors you have to think something's true to him wanting out, and certainly that he's not going to re-sign there.
Yep.
So you take him, you get him out, and you don't have to worry about whether he trying to sign him to an extension this offseason. And you bring in Karis LeVert, who fits in perfectly with kind of the Pacers' DNA, who they are as an organization, is under control. It's not a terrible contract. He's a very good NBA player. To me, it's an A+. And you have this foundation now locked in. Now, the question is, do they have enough? Because they're kind of in the lots of really good players and no star category that you just talked about, Chris. But that's another conversation.
They're the middle of the decade Atlanta Hawks.
It's another conversation for another day. But the point is that the core of the Pacers was not Victor Oladipo anymore. It's Domantas Sabonis, it's Malcolm Brogdon. It's this group of guys that they have locked in for multiple seasons now, and you just throw LeVert in there.
I was a huge fan of it. Huge fan of it. It's one of those trades that, like, on paper, it makes sense that the Rockets also have to give up a second-round pick because it's LeVert for Oladipo just on the surface, and right now Oladipo is probably still the more productive NBA player, or at least the guy that's more attractive, at least at this point. But it's at the same time one of those things. I get it, but I'm like jumping for joy if I'm in Kevin Pritchard's office right now, because we went and got a guy that's really good for a guy that didn't want to be here anymore, and we got to add another pick into our repertoire of picks. So I was also a huge fan of the peripherals. Jared Allen gives the Cavs flexibility, and like I said, the Cavs doing this makes it clear that they have faith in what they have there, right? That they've transitioned from rebuild to fine-tuning, maybe, or filling in the cracks, or because you don't make a move like this to clearly make your team better if you're still on the fence about the foundation that your team has. And I think it's certainly warranted for them to feel good about what they have. I'm not criticizing them by any stretch of the imagination, but making a move like that screams to me that the Cavs feel good about what they have in Cleveland right now, and that they're ready to start, sharpening the edges, fine-tuning, filling in the cracks, around the foundation that they have with Darius Garland, Colin Sexton, and now Jared Allen, and Isaac Okoro, of course.
Absolutely.
Coming up next, we've got football this weekend. More football, lots of football. It's going to be good. We're going to talk about the divisional round when we come back. You're watching 110 Daily on the 110 Sports Network.